Welcome back to the shop, my friends. Steve here at SKS Props, and in today's build video, I have another foam pumpkin creation, this time a beholder. Now, a couple years ago, I made a mimic pumpkin, and this video was extremely popular. If you haven't checked it out, I'll be sure to link it down below. But I figured let's go ahead and continue with that D&D theme. Both of these, of course, are made out of the craft foam pumpkins that you can find at most hardware and craft stores this time of the year within the US. All of the details are made completely out of my HD foam and foam clay, both of which you can find over at Blick Art Materials. And if you want to continue to support me and the channel, by all means, go through the links that are in the description section and those that are on my website. Every time you do, not only are you getting the best foam to craft with, but by supporting me, I get to show you how to make awesome things like this. So I want to show you what it takes to put a beholder pumpkin together. Let's go ahead and get started. The main pieces you're going to need for this project are a craft foam pumpkin and some clear Christmas bulbs. I want some circles to match the interior diameter of the bulbs. These are going to be traced and cut out of some 10mm foam. A small bit of foam clay is going to be pressed into the bulb along with the 10mm circle. This is going to help distribute the pressure of the foam clay evenly. Then I can remove the clay from the bulb and set it aside to dry. This process will be repeated for all 10 of the smaller eyes. A large leather hole punch is going to be used to cut into the clay and define the iris. More foam clay is going to be rolled out and pressed into the larger bulb. By wetting the clay beforehand, it can't help but stick to the foam circle. A small jar is also pressed into this eye to define the iris. While the eyes are allowed to dry for at least 24 hours, I'm going to turn my attention to the pumpkin. Using a pencil, I'm going to draw on a rough placement for the main eye and the mouth. As demonstrated in my previous videos, a heat tool with a scalpel blade is going to be used to cut into the pumpkin. The speed here on the video has been sped up, but just remember when cutting the pumpkin to go slow and steady. Utilize the heat from the tool and the blade more than the pressure from your hand. Excess material can be removed from the inside to help the bulb fit better. I also take this time to remove the pencil lines with an eraser. The eyes have been allowed to dry for 24 hours, and now it's time to sand the surface. Now, foam clay sands really well, and you could easily take too much. It's now time to affix the eyeballs to the foam circles using a little bit of super glue. To define the pupil of each eye, I'm going to use a Forstner bit and lightly press into the surface. The foam clay eyes now need to be sealed, so I'm going to use light coats of black Plastidip and gray. After these have been allowed to dry, I can then dust the surface with some Krylon matte flat khaki. I'm going to start adding some life to these eyes by doing a wash of Liquitex Heavy Body Cadmium Red Light. More of the cadmium is going to be used, but this time with minimal water. I'm applying a more opaque pigment to the irises using a small filbert brush. The main point here is getting a good amount of paint onto the surface. Liquitex Heavy Body Parchment is going to be used for the main body of each eye. This paint is going to be applied around the iris of each eye using one brush, and then switching over to another brush, the paint is feathered down to the outside edge. For some additional textures on the eyes, I'm going to splatter the cadmium onto the sides using a toothbrush. Using a very fine detail brush, small veins can be painted from the outside of the eye towards the center. After the eyes have dried, it's now time to work on the irises. I'm going to start by darkening them up a bit using some Liquitex Red Oxide. The pupils are painted using straight out of the tube Liquitex Mars Black. Going back to my cadmium red, I can now add a highlight around the exterior of the iris. Liquitex Raw Sienna can be applied around the pupil using a very small detail brush. And at this point, I'm not using any water in the process, just the paint itself. I really want the eyes to pop, so I'm going to be using some Liquitex Cadmium Yellow on top of this Raw Sienna. The paint is first applied around the pupil with a flathead brush, and then dragged out from the center towards the sides using a liner brush. Using the brush strokes in this way, it gives the eyes kind of this starburst look. Nothing gives more believability to eyes than adding a gloss, so for this process I'm going to be combining some 5-minute epoxy. After the two halves of the compound have been thoroughly mixed, a small amount can be applied to the pupil of each eye using a tongue depressor. And then after it sets up just a little bit, I could then go around the exterior of each iris. To help alleviate any air bubbles, I hit each one of these with my heat gun. To add a gloss to the main body of the eyeball, I'm going to be using some multi-surface floor shine. You could use the 5-minute epoxy for this part as well, but applying the floor shine with the brush makes this application a lot easier. A little bit of super glue is applied around the exterior of each circle, and then the bulbs can be pressed down to the correct height. The same process is going to be used for the big eyeball as well, the only difference being it's first going to be glued to a backing of 2mm foam. Super glue can then be applied to this and the large bulb can then be placed on top. Additional adhesive is applied to this 2mm backing, and then the foam and the eyeball can be pressed to the interior of the foam pumpkin. All the additional surface area just makes it a lot easier to glue the eyeball into place. To attach the smaller eyeballs to the pumpkin, I'm going to be using some 18 gauge steel wire. While grasping one end of the wire with my pliers, I then spin the hook in the drill. So at this point I pick placement for the stalks, and I'm going to drill 2 small holes into the pumpkin. The ends of the wire can be fed through and then twisted together on the interior. This process can then be repeated for all 10 of the eye stalks. I did make note of where I was going to put all of them because I didn't want them to cover each other up. I could also help this process by manipulating the wires once they were in place, but if nothing else, you could always play around with the process and do what you think looks good. To add some additional security on the interior, I cut small strips of 2mm foam. These were then going to be super glued over the twisted ends on the interior of the pumpkin. This made sure none of the wires were going to pull out or go anywhere, and you don't see any of this once it's painted. The back of the eyeball can then be super glued to the loop on each stalk. And just like the interior, a small strip of 2mm foam is glued on top for additional security. And these videos are just about suggesting different ways to accomplish this. So if you can think of a better way to fulfill this for your pumpkin, feel free to do that. With all my eyeballs attached, he's looking like one happy guy. To give the stalk some volume, I'm going to be cutting some irregular strips of 6mm foam. The wavy cuts will help the stalks look more like vines in the end. The tip of the cut is glued to the back of the eyeball, and then once secured, it's wrapped all the way around the stalk down to the surface of the pumpkin. Any excess foam can be trimmed away with scissors, and then the end is glued down. This process can then be repeated for each stalk, starting at the eyeball and then ending at the pumpkin. And yes, believe me, I know how time-consuming it is because there are 10 eyeballs in all. To build the stalks up even more, this process is going to be repeated, but this time using 2mm strips of foam. The same wavy cuts are applied to all of these strips as well. The 2mm strips are glued down in the same way. I will say additional adhesive is added to the 2mm strips while they're working their way down the stalk. Additional 2mm strips are also attached to the eyes. These are applied kind of at that break point, where the foam clay eyeball meets that 10mm circle. These help as an additional detail, but also by covering that seam. 2mm foam is also applied to the lower edge of the eyeball to start building out his lower lid. More foam clay is now going to be used on the back of each eyeball stalk. Water is applied to help the foam clay stick, and then a generous amount is applied to the back of the eye. This can then be moved around with my fingers until it starts to overlap those 2mm strips that we glued on earlier. And here's a good shot where it shows how much of the back of the eyes get rounded over using that foam clay. And again, silicone tip tools and tongue depressors can be used to add details to each piece. Water is added to the pumpkin and foam clay can be applied to the surface, starting to build up the lower section of the eye. To bulk up the upper section, I roll out some foam clay and apply that directly to the surface, once again using water to help attach it to the pumpkin. And all of this really just depends on the look you're going for and how smooth you want the foam clay's transition. You could spend a long time smoothing material out with your fingers or different tools, or you could get a general idea now and then smooth that out and detail it with sandpaper later on. I want that retro look from some of the beholders of the past, so I'm going to sculpt these little nodule scales onto the surface. What's a beholder without a mouthful of teeth? And to make mine, I'm going to be using some 20mm HD foam round dowels. Each one of the teeth is going to be cut to length and then shaped with my rotary tool. After the teeth have been shaped, I can then heat seal each one of them to smooth the foam out. To attach the teeth, I'm going to cut a slit at the top and a slit at the back. This is going to create a small shelf that I'm going to add super glue to. After the super glue had been added, I could then glue them to the mouth of the pumpkin, but that small shelf helps them protrude a little bit from the rest of the face. With all the teeth in place, it's now time to add the gums. I once again use water to wet the foam and the surface. And then after rolling out some foam clay, this could be pressed onto the teeth. I could then use my fingers and a silicone tip tool to make sure that the material was firmly pressed into place. Additional water is used to smooth out the foam clay, as well as using various sculpting tools to help redefine the teeth. Using a very stiff bristled brush, I press that into the foam clay, giving a unique texture to the surface. Once again though, this is going to be less defined once the foam clay dries. Gums are also going to be applied to the lower jaw of the pumpkin, once again rolling out the clay and applying it to the surface. The only thing to note here is that the lower gums are going to be more visible, so I make sure that the clay is pressed back further to help envelop the teeth. Now here's the big difference. The inside of the gum will be visible on the bottom. So I rolled out more foam clay and I pressed it back behind. Now it's not a large area, so it's a little more difficult to work with, but as long as you utilize your silicone tip tools, you should be fine. Looking at some of my old school references, I'm going to be adding multiple folds to the outside of the mouth. Just like the gums, these are applied in the exact same way, rolling up the foam clay and then applying it to a surface that's wet. And again, my pumpkin and my builds are just a suggestion. Feel free to take or leave any of these for your build. I really like my texture brush now, and I may have to keep this one separate specifically for this purpose. The folds of his mouth, of course, have to be mirrored to the opposite side. For the upper lip, I added very small strands of foam clay in multiple layers, making sure that each layer is thoroughly attached before the other one is laid on top. And since I did do an upper lip, I went ahead and did a lower lip as well. Now this lip isn't really going to be seen all that much, but just like all my builds, if I didn't do it 100%, I'd know. And if you haven't ever worked with foam clay before, I think a project like this would be a great first opportunity, because you have a nice hard surface for the foam clay to interact with, but it's also super simple to smooth it out and blend it into the pumpkin. Now of course the big eye is the focal point on this monster, and I'd like to add a lot of detail around here to draw the viewer in. I'm very much an additive sculptor, so utilizing various tubes of foam clay to build the surface up like this is perfect for my workflow. And here you can see I'm just using my hands and various spatula tools to get the correct contours. It's when I switch over to the silicone tip tools that I can really start to put those details in. Again, I'm going to remind you, just because the foam clay is going to shrink a little bit, you want your details to be more dramatic than what you think you'd need. While the front of the face dries, I'm going to go back to working on the eyeball stalks. Just like the details on the front though, I'm going to be making the tubes of foam clay and then wrapping those around the stalks up to the eye. But unlike the HD foam, the foam clay adds more of an organic look, so it's better to replicate that viney stalk that I'm going for. Now don't forget to wet the surface of each one of these stalks before adding your foam clay, and I'm using that same stiff bristle brush to add texture to these as well. The foam clay has thoroughly dried for a couple of days while I was out of town, so now I'm going to use some frog tape to cover up all the bulbs while I prep the surface. A couple of light coats of Plasti-Dip as well as some red oxide and blue primers are going to be applied to the surface. The main skin of the beholder will be made up of several different colors: Liquitex Cobalt Blue, Brilliant Purple, and Dioxazine Purple. I'm going to start off with Cobalt Blue, and this is going to be dry brushed upon most of the surfaces using a 1-inch mop brush. Now I'm going to apply a wash to the entire thing with a mixture of Cobalt Blue, Dioxazine Purple, and a bunch of water. I want this mixture to get down into all those details that have been sculpted into the foam clay. Excess pigments can be mopped up using a damp paper towel. While that dries, I want to make his tongue, and some basic shapes are going to be sketched out onto 2 pieces of 10mm foam. The smaller piece is going to be the underside of the tongue, and it's going to be super glued to the larger piece while it's curved. This will make sure that both these pieces retain this curve and won't go flat. Sketching a central line for the tongue, I can now round over all of the edges with my rotary tool. And this is using a smooth sanding drum. If you have not seen my video on how I make my own custom drums, be sure to check that out. With the tongue sanded, I can now heat seal the foam with my heat gun. Even though most of these textures will never be seen by the time it's all said and done, I took the end of a ballpoint pen and gave my tongue some taste buds. I prepped the tongue with some Plasti Dip, a little bit of that primer blue, and a dusting of light green. Some FX brand Jolt is going to be stippled onto the end of the tongue. Now this isn't going to be the final color, but it gives a good base for the transparent color that will go on top. And this tongue is going to be sealed with a dusting of Valspar gloss. I could have also used the floor shine. Some super glue is added to the back and the bottom of the tongue before it's pressed into place on the interior. More super glue is added to the tip of the tongue and secured right behind the front teeth. My wash has dried, so now it's time to add my next layer of Dioxazine Purple and Brilliant Purple. Now this is going to be applied to the surface at this point kind of haphazardly. Primarily what I'm doing is picking out light sources and highlight points. The next layer is applied more deliberate for highlights and with less water. Medium magenta is going to be painted onto the gums. The first layer here is going to be pretty thin. This is just to get the color down. Just like the purple, the second layer is applied with a little more purpose and a little less water. Now this has to be one of my favorite parts, removing that frog tape from all of the eyes. And you can see it did a great job protecting them from all the various primers and paints. I need to start blocking in the teeth, and to do that I'm going to use some Liquitex Raw Sienna. This pigment is going to be very watered down and applied with a filbert brush. And the whole point of keeping the paint with quite a bit of water in it is some of that purple still shows through, so it does a great job desaturating that base layer. And again, you guys know me, you know I love my layers, and you know I love my color theory. The second layer of Raw Sienna is going to be applied with no water. I'm going to start at the tip of each tooth and work my way up, feathering the pigment. This is going to give me a fantastic gradient transition without actually having to use an airbrush. While I allow the teeth to dry, I can go back with more of that magenta and really start to highlight the gums. And as you can see with this project, I'm moving from place to place. If one place needs to dry, I'll completely move to a different color somewhere else. As a highlight to the eyes and the mouth, I'm going to be using FX brand Sabre Blue. Now I've talked about this paint before, it's very thin and very transparent, so I'm going to apply it first to the tongue, allowing that green that I laid down to show through. Switching over to a liner brush, I'm going to carefully apply this paint to the outside of the large eye. I could then feather it out a little bit using a small filbert brush. This process was also applied to the top eyelid as well. And remember, with these FX paints, do not add water. You just want to use the paint right out of the tub. And if you need to get any of it off the bulb, just use a little bit of water on a clean, hard bristle brush. And here's another part I really wasn't looking forward to, but that's outlining each one of the smaller individual eyes. But I will say that metallic blue works really well with the matte purple. The Sabre Blue is also used on the individual scales of the Beholder. This kind of ties everything together while still having that nice purple for the base color. And for around the mouth, the lower section of the pumpkin, I switch over to a mop brush. This helps me cover a lot more ground and I don't have to be as precise with placement. My teeth are now dry, so I'm going to go back for the highlight, and I'm going to be using some Liquitex Heavy Body Unbleached Titanium. Just like I had done with the raw sienna last time, I'm not adding any water to this. I'm starting at the tip of each tooth and adding a decent amount of pigment to that area. Then when I have enough paint removed from the brush, I'll then work up the tooth, feathering that pigment out. This gives a nice gradual gradation from the tip of the tooth to the gum. I decided to paint the stem of the pumpkin a little bit darker, so I mixed up some Mars Black and Dioxazine Purple. This mixture is applied to the surface using a filbert brush. Just like the eyes, the teeth and the gums gotta look legit, so we're going to be adding a gloss to them as well. Breaking out some more 5-minute epoxy, this mixture is applied to the teeth and the gums using a 1-inch chip brush. A second layer of the epoxy was mixed up and applied to the outside of the mouth and the tongue. And this is a great way to add a gloss to a prop and it won't ever dull. Now because the epoxy can get messy, I'm going to use some Vallejo gloss varnish around the eyes. This is going to be a lot easier to control, and I can apply it with a small detail brush and not worry about getting it on the bulbs. This is followed up by applying it to the outside edge of each of the smaller eyes. I want to fill some of the negative space inside the pumpkin with some straw, but this looks a little too clean. So I sprayed it with a little bit of that blue primer before shoving it to the inside of the mouth. And because a beholder spews magic, I of course want some lights on the inside. So I have some haunted living lights from years ago. And these are great because you just slap in some AA's and the lights have multiple configurations. So you all can see what it takes to create your own custom beholder pumpkin. And like I had mentioned in the beginning, I have multiple foam pumpkin tutorials on my channel, all with different techniques that you can utilize in your own spooky creation. So if you are building any of my builds or utilizing some HD foam, be sure to tag me at SKS Props on Twitter and Instagram because I love seeing your creations. Until next time, build your best with the best. HD Foam.